Hey everybody, this is Rydo and we're back to video game news for Wednesday, November 13th. So I had some distracting meetings that put me in a different time zone, basically. Not physically, but as far as just where I had free time. So I was going to stream earlier today. Originally I was going to try and stream at around the original time early in the morning. Then I got distracted and was going to stream in the later evening, afternoon, and then I fell asleep, and so now I'm streaming in the late evening, and once again I am dropping frames, which, I mean, this is just super frustrating because there's just no excuse or no reason for it. Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And let me just quickly jump into the settings while live streaming and see if something changed. Let's see. No. So inherently, I think part of what happens here is that your internet service provider, when they first install something or first get you as a customer, has you on the deluxe lane, the super fast highway lane of the internet, and then after a year after that initial locked in high speed rates or whatever happens, even if the speeds don't change, you get put into the lower priority list in favor of something bigger. Now, it might not be that nefarious. It might be more of a case that, say, a new fiber to the premises provider shows up in a neighborhood. They install fiber to one house, and the fiber internet is shared at some junction point up the line. And then over the course of a year or two, more people sign up for the fiber to the premises because they're advertising it heavily, giving discounts. And so then that whole trunk of the tree, that trunk line is literally what it's called, I think, gets just saturated over time, and the internet just gets worse and worse. Now, I am in an escalated version of the medium-sized emergency that I've been dealing with, so that does potentially give me an opportunity to make some changes, although inherently the reason for the changes is not going to be particularly great, and more than likely I'm just going to think about a doorbell. I think I just got a package delivered. Let's see. Let's go ahead and hang up on that. But yeah, there's probably gonna try and go cheaper, not better quality as far as internet goes. Although, who knows, I could certainly move some things around. A lot of changes could be happening, and inherently, without getting into any details or private information, I will say that things could get fairly bad for me fairly quickly, and I may just miss scrolling. I may just miss streaming even, let alone pre-recording footage, which I'm still playing Borderlands pre-sequel, and it's still mediocrely going forward. It's just not really a great experience so far, or I'm just not having a great amount of fun with it right now, and really haven't from the beginning. And so yeah, inherently I've got a lot of work to do, and I could have a lot more work to do that's not YouTube related, and so I may miss even streaming. Now this is interesting. Yu-Gi-Oh! Neuron is an official support app for the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game, which definitely for a game that has over 10,000 cards, it would be helpful if that so much existed. Although this is basically yet another example of Konami being pretty ADD with Yu-Gi-Oh! Because let's not forget that there's also Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, and there probably is at least one other Yu-Gi-Oh! Game that is available for cell phones that's still playable. And there's Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, and also they haven't really done anything to bring Yu-Gi-Oh! Rush as a concept to the West. This definitely seems like this is a knee-jerk reaction to the Pokemon the Trading Card Game, and the Pokemon the Trading Card Game is just a very different type of game, considering those cards are very simple and there's not really that much of them because the variety is somewhat low. It's just the same Pokemon with different art in many cases. And yes, over the years, Pokemon have gone from the original 150 or so up to probably close to 500. But 500 cards with unique attacks is nothing compared to 10,000 cards with unique attacks, and Yu-Gi-Oh's cards have a lot more text and explanation on what they do, whereas Pokemon cards, for the most part, are just attacks that do a certain amount of damage. There really isn't even a real application of a defense mechanic in the Pokemon trading card game. So the game balance is very, very simple. Like a Earth type Pokemon takes the same amount of damage from a Lightning type Pokemon, a Pikachu, as a Water type Pokemon would. And if you were going to make the Pokemon trading card game evolve, you would probably add some kind of defense on top of the weakness mechanic that you would use in a more complicated version. And yeah, that would be a way of rebooting the Pokemon trading card game and selling more, is if you all of a sudden did add a new mechanic like that. But Pokemon is supposed to be baby's first RPG in video game form, and Pokemon the trading card game following suit is supposed to be the baby's first collectible card game. And certainly the Pokemon trading card game, which I'm still playing on my phone, is very much more focused on you opening packs and spending microtransaction money, which I don't know if this Yu-Gi-Oh! Neuron game is going to have any microtransactions or not. It may very well just be a tournament app replacing a tournament website that probably already existed. But yeah, I'm actually being encouraged to play a lot of the Pokemon trading card game is not really the focus of the mobile game. They are having events now and trying to get you to play till you get like 25 wins, which is kind of hard because without spending money, it's kind of impossible to grind and get more card packs to open, more resources, hourglasses to open card packs. So a really lucky initial draw of an account will set you way better than a really unlucky initial draw. And you'll have a hard time telling whether you had a lucky start or not on that case. The Steam DB charts here seem to be showing maybe a little bit more movement on the bottom of the charts. But yeah, still not really a lot for me to talk about. While I am playing Borderlands pre-sequel to make footage, I'm also killing time sometimes just watching streaming. I finished the Korean drama A Judge from Hell on Hulu, which it's an alright show. It definitely is gonna come down to a factor at the end that doesn't seem particularly obvious, is that there is more of a mystery going along throughout all the episodes in the show, and all the episodes are frankly a little bit more connected than you would think they were. I've seen a lot of Korean shows where they have a haughty, kind of angry, mean, aggressive female Korean protagonist, and by the female protagonist in the show being a demon judge from hell, she gets to play with that, but then about a quarter of the way through she starts to soften up, and it falls back into being a more of a Korean romance drama, which those aspects will come out of nowhere to people who aren't really more familiar with the way Korean shows often go, which is that multiple genres tend to be mixed, and you're not going to get just a basic show. Like A Judge from Hell, the Korean show, would look very much like the Lucifer Fox/Netflix series, if a Westerner made it, and in particular the fact that Lucifer is based a little bit by a comic doesn't even matter, where the Lucifer Netflix series was a monster of the week, mystery of the week type show that, yes, did have some hints of the romance too, but didn't really go too far with it or focus too much on it. So yeah, I watched that. Not terrible. Here my chart is getting up there with the different color palettes, certainly, and there is just definitely some weirdness on how Google Charts from Google Sheets, charts that are made from the Google Sheets Excel online Excel competitor, pick their colors. You get into this lighter and lighter pastel colors, and then it jumps down into a very dark color palette. I would much prefer that it start with the darker ones and get lighter and lighter, or start even with the lightest ones, which most people probably wouldn't want, and then get darker and darker. And I assume it's just going to go around in circles as we get more sample sets. But yeah, I guess I need to just try and train myself better and better to skip these experiences here and skip through this chart pretty quickly. Steam has a cooking fest that it's promoting between now and November 18th, and then it is fairly working its way, I imagine, towards a fall festival sale that may not actually be on like November 25th, Black Friday, but is going to be around that timeline anyways, that time frame. Yeah. Also, Steam, we haven't gotten to it yet, has announced a limited edition white version of the Steam Deck. And did I scroll past any sales I actually care about to look at? Yeah, I'm in a very weird position, certainly because of this medium-sized emergency. As far as what do I want to potentially purchase before tariffs lock in and electronics get really expensive, versus do I want to buy anything at all and try to just save money? Here we have on new and trending Mind Over Magnet, which is Game Maker's Toolkit's game. So we'll talk about that. In that, yeah, this is a YouTuber who has a YouTube channel called Game Maker's Toolkit, where he talks about the development of games. Unfortunately, I guess there's an irony here in that it's kind of years later, after his YouTube channel has been somewhat successful, that he's actually made a video game and released it. We can see that Mind Over Magnet is rated very positively at the moment with 99 reviews, but there is definitely a existing history of me trying to cover YouTubers' video games, or games that have like sponsor licensed appearances, like Angry Video Games or Penny Arcade games, and it's just never really worked particularly well. It hasn't got me a lot of views. The games haven't been particularly great. Now, Mind Over Magnet might be in a unique spot in that it's not just throwing a YouTuber into a game like the PewDiePie game or the Angry Video Game Nerd game. This game is designed with an actual concept and an actual gameplay experience that is first and foremost the focus. So yeah, you throw around this magnet and then you magnetize it to go up and down, and sometimes you use it to block certain things like lasers here so that you can move further up. So yeah, overall, something that looks like it could be fairly good. Rise of the Golden Idol. See, like, clicking on these games, probably games I've already looked at. This is on the fall list, so I have made YouTube shorts on it. Oh, I should talk about YouTube shorts. Apparently I got signed out at some point too. Great. The 3-minute YouTube shorts that were supposed to have been fully programmed and released as far as the interface, and whether they'd show up in the shorts tab or whether they'd show up as pre-recorded videos, which they were never supposed to show up as pre-recorded videos. Well, they've pushed back the full rollout of that until December 1st, and I wouldn't be surprised if they push back the full rollout of 3-minute longer shorts, up to 3-minute longer shorts, even longer. Because, yeah, YouTube apparently can't do a feature rollout these days. Interesting, on the front page though, this limited edition white Steam Deck is not even being promoted. Probably because it's just limited edition, and probably because it's an experiment. Now I want you to, when this circles around, take a look at the screen bezels here, the blackness between the screen and the side of the plastic, because that is what would stand out the most when actually looking at the game, is that you are just not going to have edge-to-edge LCD in that case. There is even light sensors, I believe, on behind the bezels in a couple of spots. Certainly, if Steam had made a new model, they probably would think about changing that, but that's not what this is. This is just a plastic color change. It has the exact same specs as the 1TB OLED Steam Deck. Then you have to get into the question about, do you really want a white case? Sure, if you're an Apple fanboy, the white might have an appeal, but even at that, Apple has different angles and different visual style than the Steam Deck would look at. That you wouldn't have this offset gray buttons on an Apple product, probably. Holding a Steam Deck, kids holding a Steam Deck, probably going to get it dirty fairly quickly. White doesn't make a lot of sense, but maybe that wouldn't be as much of an issue. You're still getting the red buttons for the power button, and gray rubber buttons for volume. Sure, it has a little bit of appeal, but it is really one of those things where you would buy this to stand out in a crowd of other people who have Steam Decks, and we just aren't at that point at all where you would be in a crowd of people with Steam Decks in almost any scenario. They even have calendar announcements for when the limited edition launches, which I think it's already launched. $649 is how much it costs to get the black version of the 1TB OLED. So you're paying a minimal $30 premium for a limited edition one. But I'd also question if this isn't limited edition because this was a short run experiment to see if they wanted to go in that direction with the color palette, or just see how a plastics injection molding manufacturer would return a product. So I wouldn't be surprised if there might be some unique defects or lack of strength in the physical body of the limited edition white compared to the black case, which is probably pretty rock solid now. People have been buying those for months and there hasn't been any complaints. And it is also very possible that they are just rushing out a limited edition because there was a little too much talk for Valve's tastes about a new version of the Steam Deck, and Valve having to come out and say that they are waiting for a technological evolution there. Which, in fairness, yeah, RDNA 4 graphics on mobile and AMD Zen 5 CPU on mobile being combined into probably an APU, a custom APU on mobile, is really what would need to happen. They are currently sold out of stock for the 64 and 256 models for being refurbished, which in fairness probably is better that only the 512 refurbished happens. They may be running out of refurbished stock in general, just because I don't think Steam Decks out of the box are that breakable or broken. So for cooking, we have Cook Serve Delicious. We have a Senran Kagura Bon Appetit, which the Senran Kagura game has been in almost every other game in the series has been the ninja girls having their clothes sliced off. But I think this game in particular was an attempt to see if they could take the Senran Kagura series into a different direction, because the heavy pressure to censor themselves, particularly from Valve, pushed them into that thought. I don't think it worked. And it's kind of ironic now it's on the front page of a Steam Fest. Although, is the Steam Fest even presented by somebody, or is this just Valve? Cooking Simulator. Good pizza, great pizza. Interesting. So, most of these games are not actually about cooking, though, and that's a way to twist there. When cooking does show up in video games, it tends not to be a particularly heavily focused on experience, and it tends not to be really that good of an experience. I ate a hamburger off a truck, which may be the first time I've ever eaten any food off of the back of a truck, and it was by far the worst hamburger I have ever eaten in my life. Just covered in charcoal burn, thin, overpriced, $3 worth of fries apparently to them equals about half a dozen fries as far as French fries, which were frozen and awful. I don't know what I really expected eating food off the back of a truck, is that somehow would be magically better, and certainly there's a question about just cleanliness and those food trucks in general, is that the inspections and to make sure that place is cleanliness probably happen even less than it happens in actual restaurants. So yeah, even if it was just like dirty, like a dirty water dog in New York, but tasted good or tasted familiar, I would have been somewhat interested in here. Yeah, I would have been somewhat happy, but it wasn't even that. Dungeon Munchies here is more of a beat 'em up looking game. Inherently, I think cooking is always just going to be a secondary game mechanic in games when it's best used. And if you wanted to properly cook, that is a fairly accessible thing you can do in the real world. There's very few people that for one reason or another just could not cook food. Even fairly young kids can be given a limited number of things that they can cook with. Even yeah, you can make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with a table knife and a spoon at most, and not involve any heat, fire, or danger as far as knives. And even that, while that may be technically food prep, would be called cooking in most people's book. Although technically cooking is the application of heat to something. It would be interesting, I guess, if there was like a Good Eats game that actively was trying to teach cooking. Of course, the Good Eats TV show is not in a particularly great shape these days, because a lot of the episodes are just really low quality in the first few seasons, and there's just no way to remaster live action TV footage to a higher quality. And Alton Brown is, I don't think, fully in control of the video footage, so it doesn't get sold on like DVD or anything, which is about as far as it could be sold, in favor of Alton Brown selling his Good Eats books, which is very possibly not a format you want when learning how to cook and learning the science behind cooking. Video games would actually make a lot of sense if there was something like a Good Eats game, whether it's VR or not, to teach people how to actually cook. But it would have to be done by somebody that actually knows how to cook, and not just be done by game developers who think food is an interesting gimmick to have in your game. And yeah, the vast majority of games are going to have some kind of food in it, so almost anything could have a cooking element in it. So it's an interesting sale on that aspect. It is definitely coming from a point of luxury, and people must admit this, to be able to fantasize about food or look at fantasy food and not actively have to eat it. There is thousands of years of human history where if you found a berry, if you found a piece of meat, you had to shove it in your face and eat it, or shove it into your children's face and eat it as soon as possible just to try and get the calories up in your daily food intake. And there certainly is still a case of that happening even now, where there's plenty of people still starving around the world, or malnutritious or undernutritious. So yeah, the luxury of playing a video game in the first place is not available to everybody, and the luxury of playing a video game that is centered around food is certainly not something everybody can enjoy. It is also, I guess, worth pointing out that the human body is not particularly restrained, so seeing food tends to encourage somebody who has more than enough calories in their body already to want to eat more food anyways. Moving on, let's go through the Video Games Chronicle news stories. And since I started late today, and since the stream is lagging still, I'm gonna try and rush through the news fairly quickly. Apparently Phil Spencer says that Avowed wasn't delayed due to quality concerns. We didn't move it because Obsidian needed the time. So inherently, I guess he's claiming they moved it to have it release with less competition from other Microsoft-owned properties, which, in fairness, that has always been a problem, where all of the games are getting released in the last 3 months of a year, when there's nothing getting released in the first 3 months of a year. Well, software sales for games in particular might shift quite a bit, and eventually Black Friday sales and things like that might shift quite a bit as they're getting earlier and earlier. But also they're not getting better per se, and overall throughout the year sales are not getting better. Things are getting more expensive, not less expensive. At least it feels like that in most cases. I definitely don't see a lot of promotion, particularly in video games, around President's Day sales, Labor Day sales, July 1st things, anything other than Black Friday, Christmas seasons. The Xbox boss Phil Spencer expresses his dislike over manipulative expansions. He says expansions aren't mandatory for first-party titles. So, this was clearly Phil Spencer was interviewed or saying something where Video Games Chronicle could pull out some elements to talk about. Now, World of Warcraft Midnight expansion is going to add player housing. Blizzard is going to reveal World of Warcraft's Midnight expansion in the summer of 2025, when it will also release Mist of Pandaria Classic, which it's been a long time since I've heard of them talking about anything new being added to the original World of Warcraft and really making a big deal about it. So this must be a fairly big deal. Looking at this trailer, this is not what I really expect World of Warcraft to look like. And I don't think World of Warcraft really does look like this. But yeah. I also saw, and I saw that YouTube Gaming on Twitter retweeted this, or the gaming Twitter account retweeted it, that apparently World of Warcraft 1, 2, and 3 have been re-released on Steam. But weirdly, I don't know if I really believe that, because I haven't seen any other news stories about it, so we'll keep an eye for news stories. And we were just on the Steam front page, and you would think a re-release of Warcraft 1, 2, and 3, the original Warcraft strategy top-down games, would at least be on the new and trending tab and not completely devoid of some placement on the front page. I definitely have some nostalgia around playing the first two Warcraft games, not World of Warcraft, the MMO, and would like to potentially play them again. Although, for a lot of those real-time strategy games, it is going to be difficult to put the time in and actually care about it and experience the first versions of those games. But as soon as I moved over to the next story, boy, do I have a frog in my throat today. Let me see if I can cough it out. 1 second. Okay. Yeah, I just had to go one story further. Blizzard has released remastered versions of Warcraft 1, Warcraft 2, and Warcraft 3 Reforged. Patch 2.0 is also announced. No, I guess this is probably Warcraft 3 Reforged patch 2.0 was also announced. So these are two sentences. Just 1 and 2 have been released. Never really played, though, Warcraft 3. As far as I recall. Let's watch the video and see if the video actually plays. Still didn't really spend any time figuring out why sometimes the videos play and sometimes they don't. It might... I thought these were on Steam, but it might be that these are more hidden in Battle.net. That'd be kind of weird. I don't think Microsoft is going to actively promote things on Battle.net. Although, it would also be weird if the game literally was not available there. So, yeah, you look at this 8-bit pixel art styles. I'm not sure I even played Warcraft 2. Looking at it, I may have only played Warcraft 1. And so, yeah, they have remastered versions that have just moved the pixely graphics, which isn't going to make it look too much different. Warcraft was just orcs and humans fighting against each other. I think it's a very different story as far as what World of Warcraft is all about at this point. I can't help but wonder, see, is this the first game once again remade? Or is this a newer game? Yeah, once you go to that different camera angle, it's hard to recognize that it is even the original game. Yeah. So. Yeah. It would be interesting, I guess, if it wasn't actually available on Battle.net and was only available on Steam. But apparently it may not be on Steam. Warcraft 1 Remastered and Warcraft Orcs vs. Humans, the original version, and Warcraft 2 Battle.net edition. It's not a terrible price, $40 for old games, but it is definitely a kind of game that you're not going to really be able to spend as much time as you'd like to do. On the other hand, I would like to potentially play Diablo Classic. But it would be kind of nice if there was more of a remaster on that too. Although, in the case of like Diablo 1, remastering the actual gameplay isn't as much necessary as giving a slightly more modernized gameplay experience. So if you gave me the story of Diablo 1 in the engine of Diablo 4, I probably would be happy with that. Although there is something to be said about the simplicity of Diablo 1 compared to playing Torchlight 2, which is what I recently played, in that all you have is 2 rings, a chest plate, a helmet, and a metal necklace. Like, that's a massive or a minimalistic 5, 6, 7 attachable items compared to close to 15 attachable items in Torchlight 2, which then, as you have more attachable items, the loot drops become more varied and more frequent. So yeah, what you run into is very much a situation where you want to own these games. Ideally, I want to own these games on Steam. Maybe I'd like them to run very nicely on Steam Deck. Certainly, Warcraft is the kind of game that would work fairly well on a Steam Deck. But I also don't want... I really wouldn't play them other than the fact that I was making YouTube content for that. Like... And the remasters on these kinds of games are going to be somewhat minimal in that there's really only so far you can remaster the graphics without also addressing the fact that the gameplay itself, I don't know what the deal is here with these cartoon version of it. StarCraft plus cartooned. Cartooned, apparently a completely different game that I've never even heard of. Again, there's room for just reboots on all those series. If Microsoft was wise, they would be doing full-on reboots with everything that Blizzard has ever made. You could just go down the list here as far as Blizzard actual properties and focus a little less on the Call of Duty Activision games. See, Warcraft 3 Reforged Patch 2.0 overhauls the environments and lighting and revamps the user interface, uprising all classic Warcraft 3 assets to HD. Yeah. No talk of it actually being on Steam though. And that's where I really want it to be. Otherwise I'm just going to forget about it if it's on the Battle.net account. In particular nowadays, because the Battle.net account itself may just go away after a certain amount of time. And Microsoft has enough money that they certainly could at some point say, we're going to give you free codes to have this game on Steam and shut down Battle.net. It's probably not financially worth them to shut down Battle.net. They could just de-emphasize it and not release anything new to Battle.net. But yeah, they could give away good old games codes, they could give away Steam codes, or they could probably just eat the lawsuit costs of just shutting down Battle.net completely. The good news, I guess, you take from this in particular, though, is that it does look like Microsoft is allowing Activision Blizzard to do something, and that is the something that people really would have wanted to see happen, whereas pre-acquisition, Activision Blizzard probably wasn't going to do anything with the Warcraft games. So we are slowly like almost a year and a half later, it feels like finally getting some positivity from that acquisition. Of course, there's been a lot of negativity around that acquisition, and all acquisitions in particular. Moving on, I was going to try and rush through the news, and I'm not really moving very fast. EA Sports FC 25 TOTW 9 full list includes 91 Bellingham and 90 Salah. Which I guess if you're into soccer, you probably know what that headline means. The Warcraft 3 30th anniversary direct stream happened, and so that's where they made the announcement. They did say that the BlizzCon was going to be fairly slow this year, although this seems like just a direct stream, and I don't think we've quite gotten to the point where actually BlizzCon has been cancelled completely, but certainly it's going that way. I don't see how Microsoft would want to keep BlizzCon going, particularly in the fashion that it has been in. I could see them perhaps keeping it if they wanted to experiment on doing their own unique Microsoft Con at a different part of the year, so work with the people who run BlizzCon to say in 6 months after BlizzCon you're going to have a Microsoft Con, or we're going to convert BlizzCon into a Microsoft convention. But yeah, seems like they're not announcing anything too new, but they are announcing things at least. Sonic 3's director is teasing a character reveal for a potential Sonic 4 movie. The Sonic 3 movie looks like it will end with yet another character reveal. Okay. They're gonna keep on pushing it for a Sonic movie series, which, heck, if Sonic became just a movie animated character that was really popular in movies, more like a comic book character, that might work better for Sonic as a character than the often lackluster Sonic games that get released. November's PlayStation Plus game catalog and classic titles have been revealed. GTA 5, Dying Light 2, Blood Omen, and Resistance games joining PlayStation Plus this month. WWE 2K24's fifth and final main DLC, the WCW pack, is available now. It includes DDP, Mr. Perfect, Lex Luger, the Great Muta, and the Iron Sheik. Which, okay, I guess that's it as far as new content for WWE 2K24, and I'd assume that they are going to start trying to sell a 2K25. It's hard to have much to say about the WWE games, and that there should have been a consistent trajectory of those games getting better with each annual release, and instead it's been very much either they get worse or they stay about the same. And it really doesn't feel like it should be that hard to, at this point, have a really good, tightly made wrestling game for the WWE, but there's not a single one that I've heard is good enough or seen enough praises of to actually want to play or promote. And I imagine WWE is just in a very different state than it was back in the days when these characters were actually wrestling. Yeah. Nostalgic wrestling games probably make some sense, but also there probably should be some focus on whatever new wrestlers are new to the scene. Apparently hundreds of Bethesda employees have struck over remote work and outsourcing policies. Fallout and the Elder Scrolls developers in Maryland and Texas held a one-day strike, which I don't know about Maryland, but in Texas, that is a right-to-work state that's not very pro-union at all. So, yeah. you very possibly might have strike protections on the federal level in Texas, but you almost certainly aren't going to have any state level strike protections. So you might see these employees getting punished or fired. Clearly the debate, the fight goes on, let's not even call it a debate, where the remote work was very popular amongst workers and it's very unpopular against management, and management is trying to force more people to stop doing remote work, often after allowing people to move or potentially drastically change their lifestyle to do remote work. And it does also scream stupidity. Like, there at any point could be a new pandemic that is 100 times worse, 1,000 times worse, 10,000 times worse than the last pandemic, or the biggest pandemic we've seen recently. And then you would just have to do remote work again. So why not just keep it? Why not embrace it? Why not find new and inventive ways to address what you don't have a problem with? A certain level of why it seems like why most people don't like remote work is because the boss can't look over the shoulder and look like they're doing a job and motivating the employees. Well, at some point, then maybe the boss should just be going to each person's house and just checking up on the employees, which, if all of a sudden bosses were showing up at people's houses that were remote working, I imagine a lot of people might hate that, but at least that would be something new and innovative instead of just undoing what you've done. Seems like also ZeniMax seems to be seeking to limit the percentage of quality assurance testers that the union is seeking to limit the amount of QA testers that ZeniMax outsources in comparison to the number of full-time workers in its bargaining president of its bargaining unit, which effectively is saying that the union says we're not going to stand by while you outsource 99% of the company or all of the QA staff and then keep the union fairly weak because of outsourcing, which a lot of outsourcing is about divide and conquer anti-union tactics. But I don't think I'm going to get into a rant today, so I'm going to move on. At least not a rant on that. Good Old Games Preservation Program aims to keep old games playable on modern PCs. 100 classic games have been re-released on GOG with updated or quality test builds. Notice here that there are some fairly recognizable games being shown here. Blade Runner, perhaps not the most recognizable, but Dungeon Keeper, Diablo, the original version of Myst, Fallout New Vegas, the original version of that, Heroes 3, System Shock 2, Vampire, The Masquerade, I think. Those are all recognizable games. I would kind of assume that these older games would run on Bazzite Linux flawlessly. It is also kind of worth pointing out that there's been some remasters of a lot of these games, so it's more for historical reasons, and these are the kinds of games that should be preserved and be in libraries more than they should be preserved by good old games just for playing. Because yeah, you almost certainly would want to play remastered versions of these games and not the original versions of the games. But yeah, I would assume that most of these are early CD-ROM, like first generation, well, probably not first generation PC games, that's probably a mistake. Windows 95's generation games. There's much older games that are text-based, or that you'd have to program in yourself, and preservation of something that was like a basic game where you had to type in the programming and play it, and if you had a floppy disk drive you could save a copy of that file and launch it later. But for a lot of people in the early first and second generation of computers, you wouldn't even have a floppy disk drive or a hard drive, so you would have to keep your computer running or type in all the game code a second time. These would be either early Windows DirectX games or pre-DirectX. And yeah, that again might be pointing to a problem with PC games, is that DirectX itself by Microsoft has been closed source and proprietary to Windows, and proprietary Microsoft and unique to Windows for so long, and game development has been almost exclusively using DirectX and Windows for so long that it's hard, certainly at this point, to make a game that would run on PC that isn't using some level of DirectX. I'd like to see the full list, though. Said there was 100 games here, but I don't see a link to this. There is a point that needs to also be mentioned, in that compatibility with modern PCs is not going to stay the same, because there is a move here, and eventually the move is going to probably happen, at which desktop computers use ARM-based CPUs instead of the x86 instruction set, which is actually the AMD 64 instruction set for 64-bit full instruction set computing and CPUs. Intel making CPUs is not doing particularly well, and may be acquired in part or in whole by other companies like NVIDIA. AMD, with their newest CPUs, doing really well, but that's not going to stay the case if there's not really any real competition. Meanwhile, every single cell phone, basically, and Apple with their M3 and M4 chips are all going with the reduced instruction set ARM infrastructure. Gaming in particular is going to suffer, and with a need to optimize. I never played the original Heroes of Might and Magic. Again, that might be a very simplistic game, although I'd probably just show it off for like 20 minutes or so. I probably wouldn't even play a single game on it for footage. I have played definitely some of these games before, and a lot of these games also have been playable through things like the ScumVM emulation, or just playable on Windows in particular. It's kind of interesting that, like, Mad Max here is being called an old game, or Shadows of Mordor is being called an old game. There's a big difference there between Sid Meier's Pirates and Mad Max. In a lot of ways, this clearly is just another way to shop on good old games. Yep. Lots of these games, I think, are available on Steam, and certainly some of these games are definitely have been remastered. Jill of the Jungle is a very early Windows 95 game that actually isn't that good, but was uniquely a female protagonist in a bikini, and so sold for the cover art. Jill of the Jungle as a name, if you could keep that or trademark that, you certainly could do a rebooted series of a 3D platforming character named Jill of the Jungle. Games like The Witcher 1, even the enhanced edition, is going to be kind of a difficult game to play. Heroes of Might and Magic Complete is probably less content than Heroes of Might and Magic Gold, but I'm not sure. Resident Evil games have all been remade, so it is very much more of a historical reason why you would want to play the original versions. I wish there was a rebooted Dungeon Keeper. Dungeon Keeper 1 is listed here. I don't see Dungeon Keeper 2. I mean, Dungeon Keeper 2 is listed here. I don't see Dungeon Keeper 1. Here it is. And yeah, there's definitely some games that would have some name recognition, although a lot of these games sold well and were, or at least were available unless they're remembered, but trying to bring back Jazz Jackrabbit, for instance, is probably not going to work. I can't off the top of my head think of any way you could make a game called Jazz Jackrabbit and it would make sense. Return to Mysterious Island, I don't think is particularly that old of a game. You definitely could make a new SWAT series, but I'm not sure people would really enjoy it. I don't recognize this one. Bing, Sex, Intrigue, and Scalpels. Interesting. This one I've never heard of. Hocus Pocus. Yep. So it's important to point out that these games were released during the era of the Gravis gamepad, so this was the real first introduction of a gamepad style controller that would work on a PC. It would have been connecting to a special joystick analog port that usually was on the back of your sound card, expansion card. And before that, there may have been some other joysticks, but they were usually flight yoke style joysticks where you're controlling things like you were controlling an airplane, which was not particularly comfortable. Almost all the joysticks before the Gravis gamepad were very rough and not good, not a lot of control. They were gimmicks that you would use, and mouse and keyboard gameplay was really the only way you would play any games on PC, which led to a lot of things like Myst, where it's more point and click style gameplay. It's also worth pointing out that games like Hocus Pocus here would have been fairly slow running on frame rates, and you just never knew whether somebody had a faster CPU or a slower CPU, so it's not very tight controls. Of course, that's going to be the true for any old game, is that once you get back to it, the controls are going to feel awful. I tried to play one of those older games and show it off, and yeah, it really could not hold my attention for more than a few minutes. So yeah, they've picked an arbitrary 100 games that they're going to be committed to make sure that they can stay playable, which really is mostly just a gimmick, because Good Old Games obviously makes money when you buy these games, and so they were already committed to make sure those games are playable. So yeah, some free positive public coverage. Here's some good news. Lollipop Chainsaw Repop sales have greatly exceeded expectations, according to the parent company, which really is the only person that it matters. If the parent company is saying it publicly that it exceeded expectations, that means they're happy, which then certainly sets you up for a hope that a new game, maybe in the style of Lollipop Chainsaw, could be made, or even a continuation of Lollipop Chainsaw could be made, taking it to a higher level. Certainly would make a lot of sense to me if you made a continuation of the Lollipop Chainsaw, in that you have a 19 or 20-year-old Juliet character going through a new zombie apocalypse in college, and that way you can move her away from being on her 18th birthday, but then something completely new in the same styling would be nice too. This is a small blow in the favor of not having massive censorship and not making a game that is just boiled down to a bland product trying to appeal to everyone. Pretty obviously, Lollipop Chainsaw is only going to appeal to a certain number of a certain subset of gamers. Now, if there was going to be a sequel though, there has to be some caveats mentioned here, in that Suda51, I believe, is working on maybe Hotel Barcelona right now, and so he probably wouldn't have time, if he even has any desire, to come back as a creative director to do something new. And James Gunn, as the co-writer, has, first of all, evolved quite a bit in what he probably would make and what he'd actually admit to liking, as he is now the person in charge of DC Comics. So yeah, James Gunn is not going to show up and be a co-writer on a niche video game unless he just has a massive passion project, and it would piss off a lot of DC comic fans, certainly, if James Gunn spent any time making a new video game or co-writing a new video game that turned out anything like Lollipop Chainsaw. So, with that being understood, Lollipop Chainsaw Repop's success may go absolutely nowhere, or it may just be some doors opening for a new generation of people at Dragami Games to make something new, which we are certainly at that point where it's time for a generational handover from creative directors to a new generation of creators. And yeah, no major controversies really, as far as I've seen around Lollipop Chainsaw Repop. It's a game that pretty much tells you what you're going to get with every screenshot. It doesn't surprise you with something you weren't expecting, like SJW messaging being crammed in, or it doesn't surprise you with a bunch of nudity when all the advertisement is bland and more wholesome. There is no real nudity in Lollipop Chainsaw, but I was just using that as a potential surprise or a suggestion of something that would be surprising in the other direction. This is what you get. You get Juliet by default in her cheerleading outfit that is more lewd and showing more skin than a real cheerleading outfit for an 18-year-old probably should. And that's kind of it. That's what you see. You see her with a chainsaw and killing zombies, which has been shown in the trailers. Also, it's basically exactly the same game as the original version, and you get the original version in the game, so there's no reason to complain about the slight changes that Repop makes, mostly to just how the game plays and trying to make it more fun in an effort to make it more fun. So yeah, nobody was surprised, and inherently avoiding surprises is a great way to advertise your game. And apparently it's a great way to sell your game. Now, I would also say if I had more time, maybe I'd want to look up Dragami Games and see what else they've released recently, or what if they've even announced anything recently. Let's see. Moving on, Xbox isn't rolling out any games for the PS5 or Switch. Spencer reiterates there are no red lines on which Xbox games could come to rival platforms. I would say probably the red line is in the accounting ledger, which is to say they would not bring out games to the PS5 or Switch if somehow they could know for certain it would not make profits, and move from being in red ink as in being negative to black ink as in being positive. Actually, in accounting, I don't think you actually make red lines, though. You could be writing in red ink and put a line through a number to say that number was written down wrong. That, I guess, might be a red line. You don't scratch out numbers when doing accounting, at least when you were doing it by hand. You put a single line through it and then you write a new number next to it. Xbox is also still open to more acquisitions. We definitely want to be in the market. We will keep our heads up for potential company buyouts. I'm not sure there's too many more game companies to acquire, but Microsoft, being a bigger company, certainly could acquire Intel. I don't think Microsoft would want to spend the capital to acquire any other major manufacturer of hardware, but they certainly could get smaller system integrators and OEM manufacturers and acquire some of that if they wanted to, although it would be very questionable as to what would be their goal as far as acquiring a system integrator or OEM manufacturer of PCs in particular. That certainly would help the consoles transition back to PCs if all of a sudden Microsoft owned Alienware or something and they had a Xbox branded gaming PC to say, here's the gaming PC you should buy to have the best experience for playing Xbox on Windows 11. But I don't think Microsoft wants to get in that business either. Inherently, it's going to come down to, is the US government going to be willing, motivated, and able to fight them on acquisitions? And maybe in the foreseeable future acquisitions will get rubber stamped, so we might very well see a buying spree from the likes of Microsoft, whether it's video game companies or whether it's other companies. But yeah, there's a trend here certainly to notice, though, in that a single question is being asked to Phil Spencer and then a response is being used to make a headline, and it's really not saying too much. So it feels to me like this is more Q&As being responded to via an interview, and the questions may have been carefully picked and the answers may have been carefully picked to just get as much hype and as much press coverage as possible. The UK retailer Argos is selling the PS5 Pro for £40 off, which, yeah, I'm not seeing enough evidence to tell me that the PS5 Pro is selling well, even though the new Sony CEO believes is trying to at least send out the message that it did sell well in the first week. Xbox is building a handheld, but it's likely years away. Phil Spencer says Xbox is working on handheld prototypes. Yeah. It is an interesting question as far as what would Microsoft bring to the table in a handheld prototype, because there's things it might bring to the table that people may not want. If all of a sudden a handheld prototype has a desktop mode that goes to Windows 11 and then Windows 11 runs terribly in a handheld form factor, then that's not something people really would want. But yeah, I would lean very far away from thinking that a handheld is going to be a Switch competitor, even if it starts off as the idea of being a Switch competitor, to believing that it has almost certainly had to pivot to be a Steam Deck competitor. And the power is then in the hands of Valve and Steam to make a device specifically designed to play games off of Steam versus Xbox Live on Windows, which the selection and the player base is much lower. And Valve is in a unique position in that they really don't have to care about the Steam Deck being successful, and are more than happy to have Microsoft make something that could just install SteamOS on it and still get the tons of money from game sales. Microsoft would have to go out of their way to make a device that could not install SteamOS on it, or could not install Steam on it at all, for it to really be something Microsoft controls. And that is an interesting question, where almost certainly Microsoft does want to control the whole experience. And so you're going to have this internal fight between Valve with SteamOS controlling the experience and Microsoft with some kind of Xbox operating system or Windows 11, more than likely, trying to control the experience. So, just on the face of it, after thinking about it for just a few seconds, it definitely feels to me like a Microsoft handheld almost certainly would suck, because, yeah, I think they would go out of their way to not be particularly compatible with Steam and SteamOS, which defeats the purpose as far as I'm concerned. Secret Levels creator says he hopes that the Concord episode will show the potential the story had. Secret Level is a Prime Video anthology series that was announced, which announced one of their anthology videos was going to be based around Concord. Concord now shut down, and the video game company that made Concord now disbanded before this episode even shows. Almost certainly that hope is going to not succeed, however, in that they are going to, I don't think too many people are going to be hyped around the Concord episode of Secret Level, and Secret Level in general just being an anthology series. I'm not sure how many people are going to be super hyped to watch the series in the first place, let alone have anything to really say after each episode. There's something around like the Twilight Zone that just can't be captured anymore. As far as when the Twilight Zone was airing, there was far fewer channels, far fewer TV shows coming out and being aired. So people would potentially sit down and watch a episode of the Twilight Zone, and even if it was a pretty bad episode, nobody's going to really complain because there's not a lot to compare it to. But in modern days, through streaming services, you could just stop watching halfway through any anthology series, halfway through any episode, and go to something else. And so there is just a need for more episodic connected storytelling to keep people's attention. Let's see. The first Dragon Quest III HD 2D remake review has been published in Famitsu. The Japanese magazine praises Dragon Quest Remake's atmosphere and charm. I keep wanting to check and see if you can get Famitsu in English. Let's see. Famitsu.com/English. Apparently not, because this is 56 days ago, so it seems like they've probably stopped doing English. Of course, we live in a different kind of world than we once did, so I could just go to Famitsu here and then click translate and then read pretty decent translations from a Japanese website. But it is an actual magazine, and clearly if it doesn't have an online presence in English, it is not going to have a physical print media version in English. It would be difficult, certainly, to use this as one of my news sources, but I should give it a consideration, because it certainly would be a different perspective, and it certainly would be a relevant perspective. There's a lot of ads here that I'd have to deal with. They've got a 60-page issue here for Goddess of Victory Nikke, which is the newest mobile game from Shift Up, the makers of Destiny Child and Stellar Blade. As far as I can tell, Goddess of Victory Nikke probably got better than what it was when I first played it when it first came out, and does seem to be making a decent amount of money. This is kind of a great example too of just showing the focus of Japanese game developers more than Western game developers, in that there's talk of Gods of Victory Nikke, Stellar Blade, Pokemon, but considerably very little talk of like Call of Duty. Yeah, I've scrolled down this entire page and there's not a single thing talking about Call of Duty. Of course, they're also kind of all over the place talking about figures based on video games too, instead of just focusing exclusively on video games. And yeah, Idolmaster, Cinderella Girls. it would definitely be a question as far as what would Famitsu replace as one of my news sources, because I don't believe I really need a fifth news source to make these streams even longer. That definitely is an issue to consider. It's not to just make streams super long by having a whole bunch of different news sources that are fairly varied. Moving on, LEGO Horizon Adventure Sailing's voice actor revealed following Lance Reddick's passing away. Lance Reddick, who originated the role, passed away last March. So, I guess it's kind of news, but we have to get all the way down to this point to see it's being played by Tim Russ, a veteran voice actor who appeared in Starfield, Horizon Forbidden West, and The Last of Us Part 2. It definitely seems like certain voice actors work with certain studios pretty consistently, which there is definitely a danger in that you might very well be owned by a publishing company as a voice actor and not have the ability to take on other auditions to other roles, or potentially go to other companies and get potentially a raise. And frankly, the Hollywood system never really fixed that. The SAG-AFTRA union pretty much just establishing a pay scale that says you have to pay a minimum, but not really doing too much to find a way to let capitalism work the way capitalism claims it works, where there would actually be competition. And the sad truth is that there is no real competition amongst voice actors, because if you don't get the gig and do it at whatever pay they want to pay you, they can certainly have one of their own employees do a terrible job, or nowadays they're going to try and have AI just voice all the characters. It is once again an example of creative endeavors just smacking in the face of capitalism and conflicting directly. The desire by management to pay the least amount of money as possible for voice actors versus the desire of actual artistic creators, whether that's voice actors or game developers, who want a good polished product. And certainly one of those things makes a better product for the end consumer of the game. I definitely am still waiting to see more information about what the actual story of LEGO Horizon Adventures is and how it really differs from the first game, or whether it is just a shot-for-shot remake in LEGO form. Yeah. LEGO Horizon Adventures doesn't have a PS5 Pro mode at launch, which maybe that's because the graphics don't really need it and wouldn't really benefit from it, because you're already just down to Lego-ified things. And yeah, a lot of the greenery and shrubbery looking at this screenshot seems to be missing for the Lego version, which, yeah, that would kind of make some sense if there was just a whole bunch of tiny little Lego blades of grass everywhere. That would be too many pixels to render on the screen at a time. Berserk Boy Studios signs up with the Among Us publisher Outer Sloth for its next game, Berserk Bits. The game release has also been pushed to 2025, so new features can be added. Don't recognize a game called Berserk Boy, though. Well, that's because that's the name of the studio, not the name of a game. Capcom has announced a Monster Hunter Outlanders, which is a, quote, authentic open-world mobile game. Teaming studio group known for Call of Duty Mobile will handle the next mobile Monster Hunter. It's interesting that they are selling Outlanders as a more authentic Monster Hunter experience, which definitely tells us that the feedback from previous mobile Monster Hunter games is that they didn't feel like Monster Hunter, which is going to be the problem with most mobile games, is that they just don't feel like a regular console or PC game, and they just feel very different. It is kind of crazy that when you say the phrase mobile games, you have a general idea of the type of games people are talking about, instead of mobile games just meaning it could be any type of game that could be anything. It's just playing on a mobile platform. And yeah, that's true before cell phones too. Like, mobile games in the form of Game Boy games were a much smaller subset of the style of games and the quality of games you would get compared to console home games. Shift Up is considering releasing Stellar Blade for PC in 2025. Stellar Blade's developer expects the game to perform better on PC than it has on the PS5. I mean, almost certainly that's the right move to go with. It would just come down to PlayStation as a publisher allowing it to be listed on PC, or Shift Up getting the rights back and releasing it themselves on PC, which, yeah, not sure which would happen first. If PlayStation as a publisher puts it on PC, there might be weird PlayStation Network requirements being added to Stellar Blade for no reason, because I don't believe Stellar Blade is even an online game. And certainly there would be some backlash around that. I think it is also worth pointing out that Video Games Chronicle has gone out of their way to put Eve in a more covered up outfit with a jacket in this screenshot than you would have seen her in practically any of the other screenshots that's available. There's not really a lot of reasons why Shift Up wouldn't do this. Shift Up is clearly in a major growth phase, and they want to get as much money to fund their next game. Probably they'd love to self-fund their next game and not have to deal with a publisher. They clearly are focused on making monies, otherwise they wouldn't have signed away the IP rights to Destiny Child for a new mobile game using the characters and the intellectual property of Destiny Child. It definitely looks like Shift Up could be a major player in a few years, 5 to 10 years, just as it might even be one of the biggest, like, Korean PC console makers in the country, South Korea. But yeah, there is also a point that needs to be mentioned, in that Stellar Blade, for as much as it was good, it also was not particularly that ambitious and was just a Nier Automata inspired clone. A very good, very pretty Nier Automata inspired clone, but the next game from Shift Up, I would hope, would have slightly more ambitious gameplay, slightly more ambitious story. But first and foremost, I definitely would like to play Stellar Blade on PC and make footage of it so I can, at the very least, talk about Destiny Child a lot. The Rhyme Studio Tequila Works has filed for insolvency. Tequila Works founders have stepped down amid mounting financial troubles. This is an interesting story because this is the first time we've really seen a company just completely fail. I covered the Sexy Brutale not too long ago. In fact, I may not have even scheduled and released that. But yeah. every other game company has sold out before this has happened. And I don't know if there's really any benefit to not sell yourself to a new company and be acquired before you go bankrupt. The only reason this would really happen is if they were just in such a massive amount of debt that they couldn't get anybody to acquire them. Now, almost certainly throughout a bankruptcy process, these games would be snatched up for even cheaper. The rights to these games would be snatched up even cheaper. Although that can create this weird situation where some holding company that has no idea how to sell games or publish games just owns the right to Rime, and thus Rime is never put on the store's shelves, never put on Steam. Things have changed quite a bit these days, so even a holding company could probably pay $100 to list Rime as is on Steam, as a Steam Direct game. But there definitely are some holding companies that own like old Atari games and weird first generation, second generation PC games, which makes it very difficult to find out who actually owns the right to a game and whether they are actually interested in having their lawyers discuss re-releasing that game. There is potentially also an argument here for abandonware, and that this has been my thought certainly in recent years, is that if a company actually goes bankrupt, its intellectual property, its creative endeavors, things that are more mental than physical, should probably become public domain instead of being sold off to some holding company or purchased by somebody else who literally would profit off of it without actually putting any creative effort into its creation. It probably would be better for society if a company goes bankrupt, it becomes abandonware. If the concept of abandonware was more of a legal concept than just a societal concept. Moving on, Xbox has released a 30-minute South of Midnight documentary. There is a danger certainly in this. One, I'm happy for them to promote the game, but there's also a danger that this may be overhyping a game that's not even out yet, when ideally we would want to see all of their focus on making the game good in the first place. Now, that being said, just in that little trailer, and I'm not going to sit here for 30 minutes watching the entire documentary, there is way more gameplay in that trailer than I have seen before. Really, this cutscene with its kind of claymation animation is the only thing I've seen before. So if all of a sudden we can see that this is more of an open world hack and slash game with platforming, well, that feels like a real video game all of a sudden, where the cutscene alone, for all I knew, was advertising a point and click adventure game. So yeah, this gameplay footage is way more inspiring, certainly. But then there is also a lot of hack and slash RPG type games. There is a big danger too, in that inside the United States, a female of African descent may not sell particularly well, and then you wouldn't be able to really point to whether it was because it's a female protagonist or because it was a of African descent protagonist. but then the game developers could certainly use that as an excuse if actually that wasn't even the reasoning behind it. And then when you get outside of the United States and the West in general, people of African descent tend not, protagonists of African descent tend not to sell well at all in Asian countries where there's just not a lot of people like that. So, yeah. You start with hurdles, trying to break barriers, trying to do the right thing, but then you also open yourself up to potential excuses if the game doesn't sell well. At a certain point, this almost feels like an Alice Madness Returns style game, which, yeah, that would be an interesting thought, certainly, that if this was a game that was compared to Alice Madness Returns. There is also going to be a thing here where this is set, I think, in Louisiana, and so all the people in Louisiana are going to be kind of redneck characters. And that's the thing about Borderlands, the pre-sequel too, is that the redneck jokes and all the characters being rednecks in the first game have either been toned down quite a bit in Borderlands pre-sequel and probably Borderlands 3, or they've been done from being, they've transitioned from being done kind of lovingly in that rednecks would find it funny too, to being more insulting. Scooter, yeah, it was definitely a lovable redneck in the Borderlands 1 game. They for certain reasons killed off Scooter as a protagonist or as a side character. I also would say there's a problem whenever you start to focus too much in these kinds of documentaries with facial capture and motion capture stuff. I saw a review of Hellblade 2 really talking about how bad Hellblade 2 really was in that person's opinion. Okay, well, certainly good to see them try and promote more of South of Midnight. Arguably, maybe there should just be more commercials for it and shorter things than just a 30-minute documentary. Let's see. Rockstar apparently has given the GTA trilogy a big graphical update. 3 years after the release, the troubled GTA trilogy has been significantly improved. Yeah, this definitely seems like a night and day transition, although arguably this is night and this is day. And this certainly highlights where just lighting can affect things quite a bit. If all of a sudden you have light maps or ray tracing added to a game, and for older games, maybe you want it to look more cartoony and more viewable. This is not easier to play by any means. This would be fairly annoying to have this dusk art style. But yeah. These are also the kinds of things that you can tweak in engine without having to really have an artist repaint the picture. And it definitely feels like this has gone too far. That being said, there's really no reverence for the GTA trilogy re-release, so the reverence is more with the original GTA games. And I am getting nowhere today. There's a quote here: "I was amazed Zelda leads react to Echoes of Wisdom speedruns and criticism. Zelda director was surprised by players' game-breaking trick." Yeah, that's not really very newsworthy. Yeah, there was a YouTuber channel that would do that. They would show game developers, speedrunners playing their games, and frankly, game developers need not know that speedrunners are even playing their games, because very rarely should you be making your game with even the knowledge that speedrunners exist. There is a few cases where if you're making your game from the idea that I know this game is going to be speedrun in the beginning, I'm designing this game to be a speedrunning game, so obviously then you'd be focused on speedrunning. But Legend of Zelda, Zelda Echoes of Wisdom in particular, is not a speedrunning game by any means. And it is probably a sad statement that this is the biggest news article I've seen around Echoes of Wisdom so far in its release. It's just speedrunners talking about it, talking about speedruns. Sony is ending the adapter that made the PSVR work on the PS5. PSVR owners have just 2 weeks to request the crucial PS5 accessory, which I guess if you need that, get it quick. That's a different adapter from the PC adapter. Let's see, EA's CEO Andrew Wilson reportedly is being considered for a top Disney job. The boss of EA is a candidate to replace Bob Iger, it's claimed. Yeah. Well, Disney needs a new CEO because Bob Iger doesn't want to be the CEO anymore, and Disney needs probably a new leadership so that it knows what to do with its Star Wars and Marvel and its legacy Disney properties on top of running the parks. That being said, I don't think anybody is particularly happy with EA, so if an EA CEO gets in there, don't expect things to get particularly better. I think there may have been a time where EA was fairly good in its early days, but I wouldn't expect that to happen. What this mostly shows is that there's actually a limited number of people who are CEOs and who would be even considered for CEOs. Not very many CEOs that would be promoted from within the ranks of a company, so yeah, you can't really pull yourself up by the bootstraps and get the big CEO position. Sony has cut the PS5 Slim Digital Edition price by $70 until Christmas. It's a better deal, certainly, and with potential tariffs in the United States, it certainly is something to consider. That being said, this is still about $400. I saw slick deals for a mid-tier gaming PC that is at least twice as powerful. At least that's what they said on Slick Deals, as far as the actual hardware inside of a PS5. So there is a thought that maybe I would just buy a pre-built $400 computer just as a backup and something I could install Bazzite Linux on without messing up my current installs and interrupting streams and all of that. But I don't think that's really the right way to go. I think at minimum you need to be paying $1,000 for a computer right now, because it's going to be $1,500 potentially in the future. In reality, $2,000 computer, super powerhouse gaming PC right now might make a lot of sense, particularly if you're going to take the big gamble that that PC might last you for 4 to 6 years, which is a tall order, certainly, but computers do last. It's just, is it really going to be viable to still play games in 2 to 6 years? I mean, 4 to 8 years. Nintendo of America has announced its Black Friday deals, including 20% off select games and Joy-Con controllers. Probably not the worst time to buy Joy-Cons Software, though, I guess the question really is, can you not download some of these first-party Nintendo games, or get them used? Which, more realistically, you can get them used for pretty cheap. And apparently Link was going to speak in Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, but Nintendo thought it didn't feel right. As the protagonist, Zelda was supposed to be the only silent character this time. There's so many news stories today? I must have missed some on Monday. Or it must have just been a ton of announcements. But I'm going to have to take a break just after we're done with all the Video Games Chronicle articles. I don't even know if we're going to make it that far. A new exciting chapter for Devil May Cry Dragon Dogma director has returned with a new AAA studio. Tencent Lightspeed Japan confirms it's hired Capcom veteran Hidetake Itsuno, which means he won't be making Devil May Cry or Dragon's Dogma games. And we'll see what he's got. Thank you, Sakurai. Smash Bros. Creator teaches cosplayer how to properly unsheath Link's sword. Which, man, that doesn't feel like news. A vinyl and plush figure company, U2's, is teasing a PlayStation collaboration. It looks like Kratos, Astro, Sly Cooper, and Ratchet figures are on the way. That's not particularly detailed. Valve is selling a limited edition Steam White OLED next week. It's, I believe, already available for purchase, but maybe I'm wrong. It costs $30 more than the black one, which is not that big of a premium. You'd spend more than $30 to find a white case, and uniquely, there really isn't a white scanner case that I've seen. Ubisoft is being sued for making The Crew unplayable. Players are suing The Crew's publisher for monetary relief and damages after its closure. The Half-Life 2 Episode 3 fan game Project Borealis gets a free demo called Project Borealis Prologue, available now on Steam. Overwatch Classic Event is bringing back the original Overwatch game with original heroes, abilities, and maps, effectively admitting that Overwatch 2, which is really the only game I think you can play right now, is not as good as the original Overwatch. And definitely, just looking at the characters from Overwatch 1, they are more interesting characters to look at than any of the characters in Overwatch 2. But yeah, this is certainly just a bait and switch experience too, in that you are only gonna be able to play it for a limited amount of time. And yeah, I was hoping that there would have been more story around the original characters, because obviously Tracer was very much liked, and this one certainly was liked, so you could have drug along through two very big fan favorite characters, the rest of the characters, and made it more of a story-based experience. Even though it's mostly going to be player versus player, there could have been cutscenes and a single player mode to make it feel like there was more there that would stay and not just disappear after every match. Stellar Blade is getting Nier Automata DLC in a photo mode this month, which, yeah, it's interesting. I was calling Stellar Blade a Nier Automata clone, and that seems to have not stopped an actual collaboration with Nier Automata to happen. Apparently it's going to have expanded lip sync support and new costumes also. And Eve's costume is taking it a whole nother generation as far as her costumes compared to the 2B's costume from Nier Automata, which arguably 2B's costume is a little bit reserved, at least reserved enough that cosplayers can wear it at conventions, whereas to properly wear an Eve costume would be to glue down so much fabric to your body that it would be difficult to make a cosplay of that, but probably fairly rewarding. Just looking at all the fabric and stitch work you would really have to do for this specific costume, where this costume is actually fairly possible to make with just a lot of leather and a lot of sewing and stitching. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle has a 14-minute gameplay deep dive video, which, while I'm not going to bother to watch it, is probably something most people should watch, because it is going to give you, I think, a much better idea of what the game looks like. I think it being a first-person game is a mistake to start with. But yeah, you can see here it is much more of a stealth game than you would expect, and much more of an adventure game than I think people are expecting. In a lot of ways it feels kind of like the first Tomb Raider game. You're using whips, you're crawling around, almost feels like a Golem game a lot of times. But yeah, I just think third person would make a lot more sense here on the visuals. Now I kind of feel like at some point I probably should cover this game just to compare it to like Indiana Jones Fate of Atlantis, but I am definitely prepared for a lot of people being shocked and disappointed by the type of game that they are given in Indiana Jones. Xbox seems to be teasing plans to bring Spyro to Game Pass. This has been updated to say Spyro Reignited Trilogy will join the subscription service this week. The Yakuza creator Nagoshi says the era of game size being most important is coming to an end. He's currently trying to shrink the map in his new studio's debut game. These are older stories, and so we won't go over them. That'll leave us at Gamatsu, 2 hours into the stream and needing to take a break. So I'm going to pause the recording and I'll be back in about 10 minutes. Okay, I'm back. So, yep. Going through the Gamatsu news now. Let's try to move a little bit faster. A Resident Evil 2 remake for iPhone, iPad, and Mac launches December 10th, free to try with in-app purchase to unlock the full game. Inherently, I guess, gamers always want to be as big of a tent as possible, so embracing the idea that some games might come to iPad and Mac with M1 chips or later, that is, again, the ARM reduced instruction set chips. But there's just too much legacy, really, for this to be the beginning of something amazing where you'll start to see every single game potentially be playable on Mac OS or iPads or things like that. That's just not going to happen. You might see a game here and there have Mac OS support, but then even a significant number of things that would have had Apple operating system support have since been dropped, because with macOS Sequoia, for instance, or I think it was macOS Mallard or something, I think it was version 10, they dropped 32-bit processor support anyways, so a x86 AMD 64 instruction set for an older Apple computer that might have been compatible with older Apple computers is just not going to be compatible with new Apple computers. So there's just this really small amount of games and software in general that will ever be compatible with Apple. And Apple doesn't care about that. Apple uses that as a kind of twisted sales pitch where people say Apple is easy. Well, of course it's easy. There's barely anything you can do with it. And if your lifestyle is more of a thing where you barely do anything with your hardware, which you're usually paying quite a premium for, then yeah, you're just not really going to be a gamer at that point. And so I don't think the audience is really there either. But it's nice to see the experiments. That being said, it's going to be a really long time and probably would never happen that AAA games would be developed for ARM chipsets. Not in the next decade or so anyways, because AAA games are always going to want to look their best, and that means having physics to represent things like gravity and hair moving around instead, and that kind of CPU intensive processing. It's just not going to be there. You're not going to have a powerhouse ARM chip that can do that. So yeah, if you're gonna, it's always going to be this divide. You're going to have something that feels like a Steam Deck, like a Switch, more like a Switch even than a Steam Deck, that is going to be low powered. Here's your mobile gaming. And then you're going to have real PC gamers, for lack of a better term, that are going to want very powerful CPUs. You only have to look as far as the newest hype for the newest AMD chip to see that that is the direction gamers want to go, is that they want faster, more powerful CPUs, not more energy efficient CPUs, or just cheaper CPUs in general. That being said, it is also worth pointing out that AMD has just announced that they're going to lay off 4% of their workforce, or about 1,000 employees, which undoubtedly they scheduled the release of a successful chip and the announcement of layoffs to be as close together as possible. Although if they had done it properly, they would have announced the layoffs, then released the chips, and then everybody would have forgotten about the layoffs. Although maybe what they wanted was reviewers to not mention the layoffs when in the first week that the newest CPU was released, then done layoffs. 1,000 employees is still a big number. It may not seem like a big number, but clearly it is. And if that's 4% of its workforce, then we kind of know the total number of employees at AMD. And that would not be too many. Almost 100,000 employees. Well, roughly. Yeah. Resident Evil 2, still much more logically playable on PC. It's also a 2019 game, so you're talking a 5-year-old game. But that does highlight that the gap is closing. That I would say probably you'd call this a AA game, since it was really just a Capcom remake. But I might very well be convinced that it actually should be called a AAA game. But anyways, that game, 5 years down the line, has now been able to be ported to mobile. I still haven't actually bought this game, and yeah. Still not really planning on doing any major software shopping as far as Steam games goes. Just definitely feels like it's going to be an all hardware Black Friday, and frankly it might just be me finally getting a 4K UHD player, which I've been putting that off. There's been a couple things I've been putting off to see if I can find a 4K TV. I do want to I want to upgrade to 4K now, even if I go somewhat cheap on it. We already talked about the Warcraft Remastered and Warcraft 2 Remastered announced for PC. Unless Gematsu had a Steam link here, though. I assume this is just going to be Battle.net for a while. We might see an experience, and so we'll have to keep an eye out here to see if maybe there's just kind of a launch window time delay in that you can only get this on Battle.net for the first week, for 6 weeks, for 6 months, and then all of a sudden, maybe even a year from now, they'll announce that it's coming to Steam. Like maybe they want to make a bigger overall announcement to say all of the Battle.net games would come to Steam at the same time. If they were going to do that, there's no real evidence that they're going to do that though. PlayStation Plus Games Catalog and Classic Catalog for November 2024 have been announced. There's a long list here on Gematsu. I'm not going to bother to go through it. Heaven Seeker, the Savior of this Cruel World, is coming to PS4 and 5 and Switch on December 5th. PlayStation versions being newly announced. This is a Steam game that's 75% positive from June, but also notice it has only 20 reviews, so it's not particularly that relevant of a game. Enough so that I can just take it off the follow list. I like the thumbnail here, but the actual picture here just looks like it's a Vampire Survivors type game, or top-down twin-stick shooter type game. Let's see, Mongol Stardive Ready Set Action trailer is available. The Netmarble action game RPG is coming to PC, iOS, and Android. It definitely feels like a different, it's PC via its own launcher, I think. It's kind of a different experience when a game is developed originally for being compatible with mobile, and so this is kind of the game where I just would not expect that it was ever going to be particularly visually demanding, like Resident Evil 2 is designed to be a little bit more visually demanding. Now, it's got to be something about, I guess, Gematsu articles and that the YouTube videos were not playing, because the YouTube videos were totally playing for the Video Games Chronicle articles. The open world racing game JDM, Japanese Drift Master for PC, launches spring 2025. Which, yeah, guess I can make a YouTube short around that. I'm going to have to rethink what I'm going to do with the YouTube shorts. I'm probably going to make them to close all the tabs and not run up my RAM usage, but then stop uploading them for another 17 days, because the ones that I have uploaded right now are just not going to work because of YouTube's failed release and upgrade of the idea of longer YouTube shorts. It doesn't make a lot of sense to go back and make 1-minute shorts though. So November is just going to be a weird month for content being released on my channel, which nobody's going to see anyways. And yeah, I'm just basically stumbling into every bad decision you could possibly do with a YouTube channel to make it less successful. There was also an update that YouTube is coming out with where if you happen to be live when a YouTube short is being watched, there will be a button that they're going to add to take viewers from YouTube shorts to my live streams, which, if that actually is successful, might be interesting. If all of a sudden I get a lot more live views for video game news because of the YouTube shorts, that would link very nicely back to where the YouTube Shorts get created in the first place. Let's see, Skate City New York has been announced for Apple Arcade. It's a sequel to Skate City. Which, if anything, I find that kind of shocking that they're still making Apple Arcade games. And again, I have to point out that Apple seems to be kind of all over the place if they are trying to get into gaming, and that their main focus was Apple Arcade, and they let other people publish games via Mac OS, but I still don't really believe Apple would ever really care about gamers. They might pretend to care about gamers for one sales season, and that's about it. I could see them even coming out with a powerhouse iPhone or iPad specifically targeted to gamers, but then not really supporting it after a year or so. The game Aloft launches in early access on January 15th of 2025. This is one that's already on the fall list. Co-op sandbox survival game set in a world of floating islands. It could be something. Very possibly is nothing. The 3D platform Miscellaneous A Tiny Tale for Switch and PC launches in 2025. Which, yeah, what I just said could be repeated verbatim. Could be something. Possibly isn't something. The Thaumaturge for PS5 and Xbox Series launches December 4th. This came out on PC. I am noticing that all the links for things, all the Steam links from Komatsu worked today. Thaumaturge is rated very positively, so I can add that to the wish list. We talked about the Good Old Games Preservation Program being announced. Locomotive launches November 21st. This looks like a point-and-click mystery comedy game. Seems like something I'd be interested in. Lollipop Chainsaw Repop for the PS4 and Xbox One launches December 2nd alongside a free pinup outfit. Which, yeah, if this is a pinup outfit, that is a very different style of outfit, which goes in different directions, certainly. Yeah, that's an intriguing thought, and that might very well be a hint at where their next game might be coming from. Although in this case, I would say the tattoo on my arm is probably shouldn't be there. There's no tattoo on her arm in a regular outfit. It is an intriguing outfit and not particularly silly and not particularly lewd. You don't have a lot of like pin-up girls or flapper era fashion games. There definitely are like times in which games could be set that very noticeably have not had very many games in it, like all of the bootlegging prohibition era times in US history would be a great time to set a mob GTA style game series. The Mafia series kind of feels like it should be set in that time, but that's really just one series. And the third game I don't think is really set in that time frame. Here we can see that Lollipop Chainsaw is 92% positive in the last 30 days, 85% positive overall. So no real complaints at all for the game. Not worth listening to, at least. The Famitsu review scores for issue 1874 are available, giving Amidama a 28 out of 40, particularly low. Call of Duty Black Ops 6, a 34 out of 40, about average. And then Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake at 35 out of 40, slightly above average. They also say Dragon Quest takes 35 hours to clear the game, or 60 to 70 hours with side activities. Which for an older Dragon Quest game, or an older JRPG, that's not a ton of time, really. I can't help but wonder if the original Dragon Quest took a lot longer and they've rebalanced it to take it less time. Yeah, that would be nice, certainly, if that was the case. And it would also point out that even the Japanese audience, which, let's face it, most people who buy Dragon Quest are probably going to be Japanese, they just don't have time for those time-wasty, grindy JRPGs like they used to. Teamy Studio and Capcom announced the Monster Hunter Outlanders for iOS and Android. It'll be interesting to see how that particularly plays. There's the videos won't play, but we can show you screenshots. I would say you probably are going to have limited map sizes in a game like this, and while they may try very hard to make it feel like a Monster Hunter game, it's probably just not going to be as big as a Monster Hunter game, really. Of course, I haven't actually played any Monster Hunter games, so I'm no expert on the subject, so I'd never really be able to know if this felt like a Monster Hunter game until I played something else. And even the most popular recent Monster Hunter game really wasn't quite like previous Monster Hunter games were, so they've kind of changed it to help it be a little bit more popular outside of Japan. There is, even in the screenshot though, the implication of co-op playing, and I just wonder if that's actually viable on mobile gaming, to have people playing online with each other. Let's see, Stellar Blade is coming to PC according to Gamatsu in 2025, whereas Video Games Chronicle said that Shift Up was considering bringing it to PC, which, that's a different way to have a headline and might be a little bit of yellow journalism. And certainly this is a more traditional screenshot of Stellar Blade. So yeah, I would fully make the accusation, which I haven't had to make this accusation very often lately, that Video Games Chronicle was actively doing a little bit of censorship / yellow journalism there by writing a headline that said they were considering to be released in 2025 when the actual quote is we're aiming for a 2025 release, and by having a screenshot that is zoomed in showing Eve wearing a coat, hiding as much of her body, also hiding the actual gameplay boss fight stuff and what else could potentially have been shown. Apparently there was an article for Bleach Rebirth of Souls too, but I don't see that article, which is weird because, yeah, this was 2 days ago and we talked about that, I think. Let's click here and see if there was something Bleach related. No. The next story after Stellar Blade would have been Arc Raiders gameplay reveal trailer, and I think we had already talked about that. Otherwise there's not really a real reason for those pages not to be open. Anyways, moving on with video games, not Video Games Chronicles, but Gaming on Linux news now. We have Knock is a chaotic top-down shooter roguelite inspired by Conway's Game of Life and other cellular automata. That certainly sounds like a mouthful. Good Old Games launched its preservation program. We talked about that. Chrono is a puzzler about time-controlling objects in the world. Interesting. I'm going to go ahead and click on the Steam link. I still need to get Steam links to actually open automatically. This one came out in October. You can see so far it's gotten 13 reviews. It's already on my follow list. But yeah, until I decide to spend the extra time to make Steam links from Gaming on Linux open, I will just open the links that catch my attention and kind of do a curated thing, although I don't inherently want to permanently curate. I'm still trying to really get the feeling of what the Gaming on Linux articles are and which ones are really important. Individual game reviews are something I'd kind of like to skip because it's going to take too much time. Here, Gaming on Linux says its Stellar Blade is coming to PC and devs expect it to exceed console. Interesting thought here that this is a Gaming on Linux article, because I wouldn't really expect Stellar Blade to play on Linux particularly well, but yeah, all you can really say here is hopefully it will work well with Valve's Proton on desktop Linux and Steam Deck. There's almost certainly not going to be an announcement that they're going to make a Linux version. It would be interesting if there were certain countries that have Linux as their just default operating systems that people use, but with the exception of North Korea and maybe China, everywhere else in the world is still leaning heavily on using some form of Windows. There are some European countries that are trying to be Linux, but I don't think it's more the governments are trying to save money by using Linux and being open source than it's a case that the individual people, gamers in those countries, want to be on Linux. Of course, that could all change fairly quickly as soon as like SteamOS comes out and potentially pre-built computers just come installed with SteamOS. It's kind of crazy that we don't even have a Steam like Bazzite Linux computers being sold, but yeah, right now it's either you buy a computer that has no operating system on it or you buy a computer with Windows installed on it. Here's a Fanatical bundle. I thought I had programmed it to not open anything with Fanatical in the headline. You face off against Mutated Snacks and Banana in Bronana, which aims to hopefully be the next Brotato game. Yeah, I'm not sure. I really think that's anything. Then there's just a weirdness here that either I skipped this game from, or I just haven't seen it yet. Vehicle combat in Scraven 66 looks nuts and I want it. This is an interesting art style, interesting group of characters. Kind of the kind of art style that I always want to have hopes might expand and develop itself into being a whole movement. Yeah, and I guess that's the problem with video games and animations, art styles in general in modern days, is that they don't become movements. People don't do that much painting, that much animation of any kind, and they don't really tend to try to copy different styles as much as they just try to copy the standard style or copy anime a lot of times. So yeah, I can't help but blame some of that heavily on the How to Draw books series. That has almost certainly pushed people into rigid thinking of art styles and how things have to look. But yeah, there's also just not enough passion around animation, I think, in modern times. Yeah, it's a shame you can't just be a painter and that is what you are known for in your life for most people these days, when really it should happen more. Like that more people should be able to just be artists and sell art or live off of grants, having Patreons, things like that. Yeah, not to shame OnlyFans content creators, but there is a certain statement on society that there are probably more financially well off OnlyFans content creators than there are financially well off artists, musicians, authors, things like that. Any one of those categories. And it's not like those two things are inherently contradictory either. Like, OnlyFans models certainly could work with artists to create a new generation of great paintings and things like that. Moving on, the Steam Stable Client update for Linux, VR, and Steam Deck has been released. I did pull out my Steam Deck and am doing kind of monthly updates there. Not really anything new to report as far as what I've seen though. It really is going to be a case until there is a major number update that comes with some significant feature. I don't expect the Steam Deck to get much better than it already is, which it's pretty good already. And certainly I don't have any time to work on any projects on the Steam Deck to try to make it better, like I was hoping I would be able to before I ran out of time and gave up on the projects I was thinking about doing. But yeah, Steam OS 4.0 is what we're really targeting. That'll be major improvements to the Steam OS part and the desktop mode part. Although it'll be foreshadowed improvements also. I doubt we're going to get a lot of surprise in new features. And for Steam in particular, it's questionable how many new features you really want or could have added to Steam. We don't want it to become this bloated universal app that does dozens of different things. We just want it to be a game launcher that mostly gets out of our way and lets us play games. So compatibility with games is still number one focus. Moving on, Karate Survivor has you kicking, punching, rolling over tables, and throwing chairs at people. Which, yeah, I'd assume that this might be a more... It looks like you click on cards to have it happen. Well, I'm not 100% sure what this game is. It does catch my attention a little now, so I'll put it on the playlist. A claw machine deck building game called Dungeon Crawler arrives November 21st. Let's look at that. Interesting, I suppose, that there is probably room for claw machines to be done in somewhat of a fun way in the video game form, because claw machines themselves are very rare and rip-offs in most cases. That being said, this doesn't really look or feel like it actually is going to play too much like a claw machine game. Yeah. Let's see, moving on, the fan-made Half-Life 2 Episode 3 demo arrives with Project Boreal's prologue. This is almost word for word the same headline that we've already seen. Direct 3D to Vulkan Translation Layer DXVK version 2.5 has been released with rewritten memory management. One would hope that means a improvement in performance or stability, or both. Also saw an article talking about how Valve was not particularly happy with the set environment and get environment commands in Linux, and that apparently that doesn't work well in multi-threaded applications, and so they went out of their way to reprogram and not use those commands as much as possible, instead catching function calls directly, which arguably is probably the way you should do most programming things like that. Of course, that may just sound like nonsense, but yeah. The difference, as I understand it, would be using set environment would be like, I'm writing this value into a public accessible whiteboard in the front of the class, and using get environment would be to look at the whiteboard and see that value, where a function call is to say, I am waiting for the actual program to call on me as a student and tell me to do something, instead of just the teacher writing everything on the blackboard for anybody to see and write. Of course, I imagine there's arguments for both. So, on the face of it, a headline like this, even though you don't really have to go, you would have to go deeper to get the actual details. You don't actually need to do that. So, a headline like this is just good news that work is being done. And certainly you're not getting those kinds of announcements on a grand scale for Windows. Microsoft has never come out with an article that I've seen that says they've updated DirectX to improve performance for specific games or for games in general. You do see GeForce video drivers that come out to improve the performance of specific games, and sometimes that might affect older games, but they're just not focused on announcing or promising any improved performance for older games. The new GeForce experience also, by the way, is available. They're going to eventually, I think after a year, phase out the current GeForce experience launcher. And from what I hear, the new GeForce Experience Unified app is probably better. Just for, at minimal, it doesn't require you to log in. Here is that article I was talking about. So, as far as the Valve dev detailing more on the work behind Steam for Linux to make Steam for Linux more stable. Now, inherently, this is the Steam client being more stable for Linux, which SteamOS is definitely heavily built on the Steam client in a Steam Deck mode, big picture like mode. But yeah, set environment, get environment is what he certainly was not happy about one of the colleagues claiming that said environment was the worst Linux API. And it's a fairly common API apparently. We may have already talked about this article, but I did go into but I did go into a deep dive reading more about it and getting the details. A lot of these issues, according to a commentator, are being worked on in the GNU library for C code, which would be what would be used to compile and run C code, which is almost all code as far as Linux base files at the moment. So if that gets fixed at a very low level of the foundation of Linux, that would fix so many other applications. It would also fix the Steam client issues. But this highlights certainly where the Steam Deck and Valve being involved in Linux a lot more has just added a lot more enthusiasm in me and probably a lot of other people that just wasn't there before as far as Linux goes. That being said, there's still a lot of people that hate Linux for having previous experiences that were rough or difficult, which in fairness, in many cases, even today, Linux would be a rough and difficult experience. I can't really recommend you install anything more than maybe Ubuntu and Bazite out of the 100 of different distros that are available. Maybe Linux Mint. Yeah, I could probably think of maybe half a dozen distros that you might consider, but yeah, I don't think though that Linux is really in general in the same position it was even a couple years ago as far as its difficulty and compatibility. For several years now, there's been more and more of a focus around making operating system distros that are more beginner user friendly, more pretty, things that really could compete with Windows, like Linux Mint. Linux Mint probably leading the charge on that aspect. And certainly Ubuntu going in a different direction and not looking like Windows, I think motivated a lot of people who were working on Ubuntu 10 years ago or so to move on to other projects, which gave a shot of adrenaline to a lot of other projects to make them prettier and more useful. There's also just other companies other than Valve that have put more of a focus on Linux. The real shame here is that Android, being based on Linux, did very little to actually help Linux as an operating system. There is still very little reason why you'd have a custom non-Android Linux install modded to a cell phone. And then this may be older stories. New Steam Beta has more game recording improvements than a Linux fix. You can grab 15 more Steam Deck games in the Fanatical Play on the Go Bundle Premium Edition. So that's a second Fanatical article. Yeah. This is interesting. This story doesn't seem to have opened up. And it seems like it just skipped right over that article. I'm not sure why. So how many of these other articles maybe were skipped over? Proton Experimental adding DLSS 3 frame generation support. Plus it fixes for Dragon Age Veilguard, Rivals of Aether 2 and more. Yeah. unless we talked about these stories before, it seems like this was the last one that was opened up. Although this was opened up. These might be older stories though. They don't seem like older stories. Some of these definitely we talked about before. Anyways, so yeah, Proton Experimental adds Deep Learning Super Sample 3 frame generation support, which is interesting, although I question whether the Steam Deck would actually be able to really use that for much as far as keeping frame rates high. There's another thing, I guess, with the next Steam Deck that could happen, is if there is just I hate to use the phrase AI chip, but if there are AI coprocessors inside of an AMD or even a NVIDIA APU in the next generation of Steam Decks, then you might very well be able to optimize using FSAA or Deep Learning Super Sampling, which then would let you have the base resolution of games at a lower resolution, lower than 1080p or lower than 2K, 4K or something like that, and then the AI chip may be able to cheat effectively and make a fake upscaled version of frames to make it look sharper and like it is a higher resolution game than it actually is running at. And in video games, if the coding got optimized well enough, it might be very hard to even notice that it's doing it. In real video, a deep learning super sampling or FSAA may actually fail pretty miserably. May just not be a particularly good algorithm or system for that. That being said, I can't help but wonder if things like deep learning super sampling and FSAA are being used to procedurally upscale movies, Blu-rays, to be 4K UHD videos. The movie 7 is about to release its 4K UHD video. Of course, I already own 7 on Blu-ray, so yeah, I'm not really looking to just replace my Blu-rays, which I may have only watched once at most, with 4K versions, unless there's new features in them, which they tend not to have any real features in them at all, or unless there is a major good quality visual upscaling there. And I could see something where a good remaster from the original film for something like Blade Runner, which is a very dark film, having that with Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos and things like that might work very well. HDR, high dynamic range colors, might work very well for that movie. But if it's done poorly, then it's not worth having. Yeah, there's going to be a limited subset of movies that even make it to 4K UHD releases before they just stop making physical discs altogether, or they have print on demand super expensive discs where like 7 is going to be $30 when it first launches. I really only want to pay $15 at most for a 4K UHD, and honestly I'd rather it be closer to 10. Moving on, a supernatural comedy point-and-click adventure, A Vampire Story, A Bat's Tale has been announced. I heard this title and did not see the screenshot, and so I definitely thought that this was just a similar name game and not a sequel to A Vampire Story point-and-click adventure game. I believe I actually own A Vampire Story, but haven't ever actually played it, so this would be kind of an interesting excuse to see if I could run the ScumVM emulator and play A Vampire Story. It is intriguing, certainly. I imagine that this developer and this publisher is not really the same people that made A Vampire Story so many years ago. But it is also certainly interesting to see such a niche and such an old game get a sequel, which not a bad thing. We really should have never lost that momentum, though, because it really should have been a case that these kinds of games were getting sequels much earlier, and that PC gaming just had a much larger collection of games available to purchase. The truth is, as consoles got more successful, CD-ROM and PC gaming became less successful. The tint back in the day was not big enough, and there were only so many gamers and only so much money to go around, and so moving over to consoles, moving over to cartridges was just cheaper, and the way people naturally migrated to. Eventually, after a couple generations, console gaming led to more people playing games overall, led to more money being in the industry. But when A Vampire Story was released back in 2008, yeah, there just weren't that many gamers, there wasn't that much money to go around. They are saying here that Autumn Moon Entertainment includes Bill Tiller, who I guess worked on The Curse of Monkey Island and The Dig. Curse of Monkey Island, it would be, I think, the third game, one of the worser Monkey Island games. Also has David Harris and other ex LucasArts veterans. So this is some older developers from LucasArts and point and click era game development in general coming together to make a game that they probably didn't have to pay for any kind of major licensing fee to make. Yeah. This also might very well be a example of what can old game programmers really do, or how can they make themselves be relevant once again in the world of game development, considering how much of game development is centered around just young programmers, new people making games, people who very possibly never played this game, never heard of the Vampire Story original game, and have no care or concern for point and click games. And then apparently several Sid Meier's games are in the Humble Bundle, which that's another thing that should have been automatically closed. Alright, and that's going to bring us to GameDeveloper.com articles. Let's see. No GameDeveloper.com article actually opened up, which tells me more than likely that yes, my macro is still broken because I haven't worked on it, but also that only the first few articles may have even had been new information, which also makes a lot of sense since GameDeveloper.com doesn't publish that many articles over the course of a week. Song of new developer Tequila Works filing for insolvency. We had talked about that already. BioWare has pulled back the veil on Dragon Age the Veilguard's magical hair tech, which, okay. This is a fairly long article here from GameDeveloper.com talking about hair technology, and frankly, I have to admit I'm having a hard time seeing which one is supposed to be better in this comparison. I'm seeing small individual strands in this hair, and then over here I'm still seeing small individual strands in the hair. Yeah, there's perhaps some lighting effects and maybe slightly better lighting on this side. But yeah, I have a hard time telling the difference here. And certainly I don't think I'd be a particularly good judge for this hairstyle. Anytime I have to pull out the magnifier, though, it probably means the detail is good enough. Although, frankly, I also think my eyes are getting worse and worse. They're pointing out here that every single strand hair asset has a high memory footprint, which eats into how much memory is allocated for other assets. So, and that has always been the case in games, is that there's been a very heavy focus on having realistic hair to the point where it has pushed the video processing technology forward and made it heavily memory intensive. Yeah, that's why video cards have like 16 gigs of RAM in them these days. And even an 8 gig video card's probably a little low. And I guess the question is, does that imply that gamers look at people's hair way more than they look at characters' eyes or eyebrows or lips or nose or ears? Because, yeah, there's not been really any talk about improving skin texture, skin color, or anything like that. I think a part of that certainly is that humans, if there was more details and texture in the skin, it would just start showing hair, follicles, and pores and pimples. Nothing that's particularly considered attractive. More wrinkles in the lips are probably not necessary, because most women defined as attractive are wearing lipstick that would smooth out wrinkles. People tend not to want to look directly in the eyes of people. I don't think people admit how much they don't do that, but yeah. And then tattoos and birthmark magical things are going to be unique. People tend not to look at ears too much. So yeah, there's just more people fetishizing about hair in games than any other aspect of the head. And in fairness, the better you make hair, the more attractive the person is going to be. More hair, more detailed hair is considered more attractive in almost every case. The only time it stops being attractive if there is less hair, if there's clumps falling out, or if it's stringy and thin. Which, noticeably, you don't see a lot of hair styles like that. You see shaved bald characters sometimes, but you don't see, hey, this person is balding on top, this person's hair is going thin. Even if they are supposed to be ghostly, like, they tend not to look like they're in bad shape hair-wise. Moving on. We already talked about Capcom and teaming up on a mobile-only Monster Hunter Outlanders. ZeniMax unions striking to protest of Microsoft remote work and outsourcing policies, we also talked about. Ubisoft has found a new chief people officer in health and food executive Sebastian Foy-de-Fond. Under Foy-de-Fond's management, Ubisoft HR team will be ensuring the department contributes significantly to the company's overall objectives, which that is the most boilerplate statement you could possibly make. It's not even worth doing a second headline. Frankly, it should have just been they have a new chief people officer, which frankly sounds like a made-up position. CPO. There certainly have been problems, though, with the HR and the employees and management relationship at Ubisoft, so hopefully he can turn the ship around. would be, I guess, their hope. Although I'm not sure that actually is Yves Guillemot's hope. There is still a lot of suspicion that they are trying to take the company private and possibly even self-sabotaging the stock value of Ubisoft to take the company private at a cheaper price. And then Xbox head Phil Spencer still wants to work with mobile and Chinese devs. With no imminent acquisitions planned, Spencer hopes to find new partners in areas vital to growth of the Xbox's platform. Inherently, Phil Spencer and Xbox, I don't think, know how to work with mobile developers and Chinese devs, because that is just a very different marketplace and a very different style of games being made, a very different way in which content is made and released. There are no Microsoft games that I can mention or think of that are putting out content updates every month for free-to-play players with microtransactions for the whales every month. And that is mobile gaming in a nutshell. And that is pretty much all Chinese development that is made is mobile games. Otherwise, and even at that, I still don't know if you really want to work with Chinese game developers. They're not particularly experienced in game development. Even mobile development, you would be better off working with a Korean company or a Japanese company for mobile development. You're dealing in China, which that means you have to deal with the Chinese government, and that makes everything more difficult too. And there's just almost no chance that your game would ever be approved to be released in China. So yeah, it's probably more than likely this is something that was said in an ask and answer question, just because that is the right thing to say, versus this actually being a thing that happens. I suppose if imports became a big thing for a very long time, maybe game companies would less focus on upgrading consoles and hardware and might try to focus more on software as far as dealing with China and international trade. But yeah, that is a big pivot to completely different companies. That's not just moving to a different focus. Anyways, let's look at all the new games on Steam. I've already gone 3 hours. Yeah, I definitely wasn't expecting to fall asleep and start so late, but then I also was not expecting this stream to go this long. These streams lately have been getting long again. Yeah, and because I'm in the middle of this whole medium to large emergency at this point, I did have some suspicion, certainly, like even yesterday, that if I was going to try and do any pre-recording of footage, I might just be too distracted, just not on the ball enough to make good content. Yeah, I might just break down into some crazy rambling more than I usually do, or who knows, maybe even break down in tears of stress and exhaustion. Yeah. I like the visuals here. Should I make a YouTube short around it though? Nah, I'll just put it on the fall list. There was Mind Over Magnet. We kind of already talked about that, so I don't feel like covering it twice. Shave and stuff. A lot of these games are already on the fall list, which does also certainly speak to fishing games back to back. It does definitely speak to the state of year, the time of year, in that a lot of games have been announced over the past, oh, what would that be, 9 months since January, and a lot of those games are now finally getting to their release dates. So far, not really running into a lot of terrible games. But yeah, there is, I guess, a level of curation that is happening here in my mind. I'm not trying to spend too much. Globalism, perhaps too generic of a name for any game. Globalism is not really the phrase that's used by people who are pro global trade and free trade. And yeah, well, I imagine a lot of people who use the phrase globalism say a bunch of nonsense. There is something to be said about the idea of corporations being able to pit entire countries against each other for their own benefit versus companies having to be restrained more inside the limits of one country and inside the laws of one country. Although that hasn't really played out great either. The United States history in particular has a long history of the CIA working to benefit actual companies and not inherently focusing on benefiting the US citizenship. Interesting. Here's another comic book style visual novel, it looks like, that I would want to see more of this too, like more animation in this style, even if these are just like motion comics or more like Telltale games and it's a comic book where you can pick just a few dialogue choices, or if it is just a kinetic visual novel where the story just goes from beginning to end and you're given no decisions. In general, it makes a lot of sense for every single Marvel and DC comic to be released onto Steam, but Steam is clearly not a platform designed for that massive influx of comic books, and they want interactive content and not passive content to be the majority of games released on Steam. But yeah, to me as a gamer, it makes a lot more sense that I would have potentially a large collection of paid for comics on my Steam account that now would be readable on Steam Deck than to potentially have to have your Steam Deck go into desktop mode and go to some website to read comics online, or to have downloaded comics and loaded it into desktop mode using a Linux comic book reader, which is really the way you would do it right now. And there is no local server options that I have experimented with yet to find out if any of them are good. I know there's a local server, comic book server called Comixed, COMIXED, but I haven't tried it out, and that uses the OPDS protocol, which is more of an ebook server protocol from Calibre ebook manager, which I would not say Calibre is configurable even to be a good place to read comics. Inherently, there's a huge difference between Calibre where you would have small collections of books from different from the same publisher or in the same series, and Action Comics in it, as far as if you had every single Action Comics on the server, from Action Comics 1 to whatever 1,000 issue is out now. It's probably close to 1,100 or 1,200 issues of Action Comics would be my guess. That the labeling and sorting of 1,000 comics is just a completely different scaled thing from a completely different focus, different types of tags, different types of ways of thinking about things. The cross references, the mini series, all of that is just something you really wouldn't have in your average ebook, which I guess at a certain level that is pointing out that I'm not gonna make a short on this one. If you want to make a book server, as far as a media server software, you probably need to start with comics and then work your way back to just regular ebooks. Start with the most complicated thing and add the most amount of features around that. Of course, you do have in competition Comic Rack Community Edition, which is Comic Rack but illegally being redistributed under the assumption that the original creator of Comic Rack has died and nobody knows that he was working on Comic Rack. He disappeared, certainly. So heavy abandonware thought there that almost certainly would not stand up in court. But honestly, if the creator of Comic Rack showed up and sued the publisher of the community edition of Comic Rack, people would jump for joy just to know the person was actually alive. But yeah, Comic Rack has its own software that has its own proprietary server. And see, yeah, that page just said I wasn't logged in, but I am logged in, so that page must have just been opened too fast. It's the only thing I can assume. And while Comic Rack is, as far as I've seen, the best software ever for organizing comics, which none of this has anything to do with video games. Tetris Forever not being received particularly well. Interesting. Let's see what the negative reviews there say. Comic Rack hasn't been modernized and updated in many years, and performance is going to start taking a hit, even though it was a very performant software originally. Just without the updates, without the newest version. There is also a problem that Comic Rack is uniquely one of the few applications that would be Windows only. So, and it's gonna be so high demanding as far as RAM and having a major database that you can't easily run it in a virtual machine and have performance. Game is not nearly worth the price tag of $44.99 Canadian. The electronic 60 version is nice, although visually glitchy. However, there are many versions of the same game among the 15 playable ones, which becomes redundant. The main ones that players might expect, NES Tetris, Western Tetris 2, actual Game Boy Tetris, are not there. The new Time Warp game has an interesting concept but does not play as smoothly as the other modern Tetris games. The lack of online multiplayer and challenging modes, on top of several glitches flashing on the screen throughout the game, are also disappointing in today's standards. Interesting how detailed these negative reviews are. Usually you get just "it sucks" or "here's the one major thing." But yeah, inherently this was going to be the problem, is that if you try to make a collection of Tetris games, only a few Tetris games are actually worth playing, and seemingly NES Tetris, Game Boy Tetris are the ones that are missing. I'll leave that on the pull list and see if maybe reviews will change over time. That is potentially a example too of where video games being released as video game documentaries confuse the issue quite a bit. That there really is not shelf space in the virtual storefront of Steam for something that would be more of a educational, like historical release, something that would be drier and less entertainment focused. Okay, well, I do believe that's going to be the end of the show. I'm not even going to bother to try and see if there's anything else to talk about. I don't think there is. 72.6% of frames dropped via the network today, so another terrible network day. And I'll have to see if I can figure out any reason for that. And yeah, again, I'll just ask people to bear with me. I'm in a weird situation right now, and it's only likely going to get weirder. So sorry for streaming at weird times. That's probably going to happen more. And sorry for perhaps being off the ball and less focused. Anyways, otherwise, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and keep on watching. Thanks.